Hi everyone, welcome and thanks so much for coming and checking out my channel. My name is Tanny and I am an independent author and someone who really just loves a great story. So today I just want to share some of the best books I've read in 2021 so far and give you guys an idea of why I love them, and maybe you'll consider checking some of them out. So I set a goal for myself this year to read about 50 books, and I think I'm about 2/3 of the way through that goal. I've read something like 35-ish books, I think. I'm not really sure. But I have read a lot of really good ones, and I'm really excited with how my reading is going this year. But there were a few that really stood out to me that I want to talk about and share with you guys today. So up first, we have the Poppy War series by R.F. Kuang. And this is a kind of grimdark fantasy novel that takes place in a fantasy world that is very heavily based on Asian culture and history with some of the wars that they've had over there. The protagonist is a girl named Rin, and she is a very unique sort of protagonist. She's very unlike other female protagonists that I've seen in most fantasy novels that I pick up. She's pretty unlikable. She is a really strong, determined person and has kind of been forced to go through some really hard things, and that's made her kind of a really hard person, but she also has a lot of vulnerability that she kind of tries to compensate for. And throughout the series, we see her kind of being manipulated by different people in power and kind of trying to take back power of her own as well. And she's just a really complex character and someone who was very nuanced in a way that felt realistic. You don't always agree with her choices. In fact, I think most of the time you probably won't agree with her choices. She makes some really terrible decisions, but you always understand exactly why she's doing what she's doing. The other characters are also really well developed, and just the exploration of war and how it impacts people and the lasting consequences and trauma that comes from that. I thought the author did a really good job of portraying all of those things. So if you're looking for a fantasy series that has a really interesting female protagonist, someone who's really complex and just interesting to follow, even if you don't always like her, definitely pick these books up. They are a little bit on the darker side and probably need all the content warnings, so keep that in mind before you go into them. There are definitely some heavy topics that are explored in a lot of detail, and it gets pretty graphic sometimes, and that can be difficult to read. But if you can handle that, I definitely think the books are worth reading, and they're really great, so check them out. Up next, we have The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. This is a science fiction, kind of almost a dystopian novel about a boy named Todd, and he is living on this planet. There's only men in his town where he lives, and something happened to the women. When the book starts, we don't really know what happened. And the men all have this condition on this new planet that they've developed where their thoughts are just constantly broadcast to everybody around them. Everyone can hear everyone else's thoughts, and you just, like, they have no privacy, and they try to control and suppress that as much as possible, or like bury certain thoughts with other thoughts. And it's a really interesting concept, and I really thought the author did a really good job of portraying that. I imagine it would have been a kind of a difficult thing to write, but it works really well in the book, and it's really interesting to see how you go through and figure out what happened to the women and what's going on the planet, and just all these questions that keep coming up and mysteries that are being unraveled. And it's really fast paced. The characters are constantly in danger and having to run for their lives from place to place, and it kept me on the edge of my seat the whole time, and I really loved it. And then there's also a dog in the book, and he is the most precious thing ever, and I loved him so much. The animals, they can kind of hear the animals' thoughts too, and so you can hear the dog, like what he's thinking and saying, and it's just so cute. I loved the dog. It's not a super happy book. There's definitely some really awful things that happen to these characters. It's part of a trilogy, so I've read this one and I've read the second one that's called The Ask and the Answer, and then I'm currently reading the third book, but I'm not very far into that one yet. But it's a really good series. I'm really enjoying it so far. So if you like something fast-paced and that'll keep you on the edge of your seat and just make you want to get answers to all these questions, I definitely recommend checking this one out. The most recent book I finished that I really loved was Sees the Stars by Mary Fan. This is a young adult science fiction novel. Sees the Stars is the third book in the series, and then the first one is Star Swept. So without getting into spoilers too much, because this was the third book, but maybe I'll talk about Star Swept a little bit. It follows this girl named Iris, and she is a student studying and learning to play the viola at this prestigious arts academy on Earth. And there are these aliens that have come and made contact with Earth and have really enjoyed the arts and the performances that Earthling artists can offer them. And so Iris is kind of competing to earn a spot on this alien world where she will be provided for and cared for and be able to pay back the debts that she's accrued while she's been in this school that she's been living at. And then as the story goes along, you kind of learn that the system is not exactly what it's being portrayed as, and there's actually a lot of really harmful things going on. This idealistic alien society, they're not so benevolent as they seem, and you kind of just watch that play out. And so the third book kind of brings everything that we've been learning over the last two books together, and it just ended in such a satisfying way. Like, the characters had to go through some really hard things the whole time, and you're just rooting for them the whole time, and parts are really sad and parts are really happy. There's like a romance that I thought was really well done. I don't always like romances in books, but this one I thought worked really well. And the way that everything just ends up by the end, like, I was driving in my car listening to the audiobook and I was just in tears, and it was just like, it was beautiful. It was everything that I wanted it to be, and it was just amazing. So if you like young adult science fiction, it's definitely worth checking out. So go pick it up and give it a try. Next up, we have The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse. This is just a really short book. It's not very long, and the pages are like, there's hardly anything on them. That's mostly just pictures and these really beautiful ink kind of illustrations that are not fully finished. They're really just kind of suggestions of drawings, which I love. Like, it works so well, and I don't even really know how to just describe this book. It's like just a book of, like, it's just like a feel-good book. Like, it just makes you happy and kind of sad, and just like things about life that just feel really true and powerful, and like, I don't know, it makes the therapist in me very happy. And just like, I wish that, like, this is a book that I would want every single human in the entire world to read, because I think it's just so powerful and so heartfelt and reminds you of things that sometimes we forget in life and things that are important to remember. So I definitely would recommend this to anyone. It's really quick to read. It's really a good uplifting thing to read if you're feeling down, or if you just need a reminder about some of the more positive things in life. This is a really good book to read. I think especially with the crazy year that we've had in 2020 and everything going on in the world. Like, it's just nice to have something positive and uplifting like this to read. And it's something that I read to my kids, and I definitely will be rereading it over and over again, I'm sure, several times throughout my life. I also read Shadow of a Dead God by Patrick Samphire. This was a book that was a finalist in the SPFBO competition that was going on. It just ended not too long ago, and a new one has started, I believe, by the time this video goes up. SPFBO is the self-published fantasy blog-off, and it's hosted by Mark Lawrence every year, and any self-published fantasy novel can be entered, and they take 300 entries, and then those entries are divided up between 10 different blogs, and they all kind of read and pick their favorites, and choose semi-finalists and then a finalist. So each of the 10 blogs will choose one finalist, and then those 10 books will compete to win the competition. I entered my book this past year, and it ended up being a semi-finalist, but then got cut, and that was pretty exciting for me, though, to have made it that far. But I ended up following along the competition and kind of seeing where different books ended up, and ended up reading a few of the finalists. And of all the finalists that I did read, this one was by far my favorite. It was so fun and engaging and exciting. So we're following this mage named Mennick Thorn, and he is not really the best mage, but he is decent enough to make kind of a living and scrape by, and he lives in this poor part of the city that he just is kind of trying to survive and get by in life. And he just has a really fun character voice. He's very kind of sarcastic and kind of just funny, and the way that he views the world makes reading the book just really entertaining. He just, like, he can't catch a break through the whole novel. He's just constantly getting himself into one mess after another. Him and his friend have been framed for this murder, and so he is trying to prove his friend's innocence and prove his own innocence, and figure out who really did it. And so it's kind of this mystery going on, but in a fantasy setting, and with this character who is just, the poor guy is just struggling, and it's just, I shouldn't laugh because it's like awful what's happening to him, but it's so fun to watch. So if that sounds interesting to you at all, definitely pick that up. It was a really entertaining read for me, and it did well in SBFBO, and all of those books that made it to the finalists I think are definitely worth checking out. So go ahead and give that a try. And if you are an author and you have a fantasy novel, check out the contest and see if you are able to still enter, or if you can maybe enter for next year's contest. All right, I saved the best for last because this book was easily like one of my favorite books I've ever read. I loved it so much, and it will have a special place in my heart forever, and I will definitely be rereading it sometime soon, hopefully. And that is The House in the Cerulean Sea. This book has my entire heart. I loved it so much. It's just a really heartwarming, happy, feel-good tale. There's, like, the plot is not as important as the characters and their relationships with each other, which normally doesn't work for me as well, but here, like, it was so good, and it's so precious, and I love it so much. So we have our main character, Linus, and he works for Dicamy, which is the department in charge of magical youth, I believe. So he's basically like a social worker in this kind of fantasy world, and I'm a social worker. I don't work like in child welfare specifically, but I do work with kids that have been adopted out of foster care and who are still in foster care, and so I interact with the child welfare system a lot. Linus is a caseworker, and so, like I said, he's basically kind of a social worker in this magical world, and his job is to go and inspect all these orphanages and just make sure that they're being run appropriately and that the kids are being taken care of. But the kids in these orphanages are like magical kids, right? So they have different powers, or there's a character who's a gnome. She's a girl, and she's a gnome, and she has a beard, and her name's Talia, and she's just adorable. And then there's like just any kind of magical kid that has, special abilities, and they're not ordinary kids. So they have to be in these special orphanages, and he goes and inspects them, and he ends up going to this one orphanage to kind of check it out, and it's like the one where they send probably the bad kids, right? The ones that are more difficult and they don't really know what else to do with them, and they send them to this orphanage. And so Linus is kind of terrified of going out there to check it out, especially because he gets the files on these kids, and one of them is the Antichrist, and he's 6 years old. His name is Lucy, and he's so precious, and I love him. So he goes there and he checks out this orphanage. The guy who's running it is really just a good caretaker and really wants the best for these kids. He's a little unorthodox in the way that he runs things, and Linus is really just trying to stay businesslike and professional, but he ends up growing really attached to these kids and to the caretaker as well. There is a romance, and it's the most precious, wholesome thing I've ever read in my life. I loved it so much, and I think everyone should read it, but especially if you like fantasy and you just don't mind sitting with characters and kind of letting the plot doesn't have to be so important sometimes. We can just sit with characters and get to know them and watch them interact and just be happy and joyful, and it's amazing. I mean, it's not all happy and joyful. There's definitely some bad things that happen in there as well, but the kids are just like the most precious, adorable people I've ever seen in a story. I want them all to come home with me. They're fantastic. So anyways, those are some of my favorite reads of 2021 so far. Be sure to leave a comment below if you've read any of those. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell if you want to see more of my future videos. And I will see you guys next time. Thanks.